Hi, Stephen Hand from Staccato in Hobart. I hear a lot of argument about what type of rapier cuts work. Now, a rapier clearly isn't a sword that is optimised for cutting, but it clearly is a sword that can cut, and I've produced a video on this previously. So what I'd like to do in this video is I'd like to look at a range of different cuts, some of which are cuts that people have suggested to me would be valid in a real fight, and most of them are cuts that the old masters suggested would be valid in a real fight. And I'm going to do those against a bit of meat, in this case a big pork roast. So, hope you enjoy. So this is just to show that it actually is a sharp rapier. As you can see, it cuts quite nicely. Alright, no difficulty at all slicing into the meat. The first cut I'm going to show you is a draw cut, which I've seen a lot of people try to do, and they say that if they miss a thrust they can do a draw cut to the neck. Now, one of the issues with this is that in typical 17th century clothes, the neck was covered by no less than 14 layers of fabric, 2 layers of wool and 12 layers of linen, right, which I've put over the top here. So let's see if I miss a thrust, can I slice the neck? I've cut through a layer of linen, so as expected, 0 damage. What if I do a full-blooded cut to the neck? We don't see the neck targeted in many fencing manuals, and you'd expect that even if it didn't cut, the sheer impact of 2.5 to 3 pounds of steel hitting your throat would be pretty unpleasant. If you look here, here's my first attempt at that, where I missed, and as you can see, pretty devastating effect, not overclothing. Okay, so let's try and get an accurate cut this time. Whoop. Okay, so if we close in, a little bit of a contusion there. Compare that with the with against nothing, so not even much damage to the cloth. We've got 1 layer of linen cut through, and yeah, I can't imagine that it would be pleasant to be hitting the neck with a full-blooded cut, but I think cutting would be the least of your worries. The next cut I want to show is one I've discussed in an earlier video, which is this tippy-tapper little cut that as soon as somebody disengages you, you sort of snap down onto their arm. And I've said that I don't think it's particularly effective. Let's have a look. Barely a mark on the cloth. The next cut I want to show you is also a cut at the arm. This one is actually illustrated in the manuals. It's illustrated by Capoferro at plate 8 and Alfieri at plate 11. And in both cases there's an attack to the leg, a thrust to the leg, and the fencer doing the cut slips back, slips the leg back, and cuts with a reverso to the outside of the arm. And I'm going to adjust the height by standing up on something to try to get this cut. Okay, not a huge amount of damage. I've cut through the wool there, but you can probably see a lot more impact onto the arm. But surprisingly, very little penetration and no real damage to the meat underneath. And this is through a typical sleeve of the period, which would have one layer of wool and two layers of linen, a woolen outer, a linen lining, and then linen shirt. The next cut I want to show you is shown by Alfieri plate 6, by Capo Ferro plate 25, and in Gigante's second book on page 28, and it's a cut to the outside of the calf. And why do you think do we attack the calf? Well, in the typical clothing of the day, the calf wasn't covered by the voluminous, big puffy pants that people wore with huge amounts of fabric to not just prevent the cut, but to soak it up and to basically swallow up the rapier. It was covered by one layer of linen. We had thin linen hose. Right, so let's see how a cut will go against the lower leg. That doesn't appear to have cut the linen. The material seems to be remarkably resistant, but you can fairly clearly see if we pull that pin out, yeah, there's a cut underneath that. That's cut the leg. I wouldn't want to be standing on that leg after, right? So it's cut in there. What's that? Nearly an inch deep, nearly 2 centimetres. Okay, so fairly effective. Looks like these masters maybe knew what they were talking about. The next cut is one that we just don't see in the manuals. It's a cut to the body. The body was typically covered by a layer of wool and about 5 layers of linen, a lot of stitching in the body. And the thing which is going to be really hard to show is that when you get hit in the body, there's a lot of give, right? Unlike more bony parts of the body. So let's have a look anyway. Okay, so this is the bit that was already been cut up. So we're hitting around here. There's where my two cuts. So it cut the wool, but not really the linen underneath. Nasty impact, but this was all done earlier. So we've got a bit of laceration, a little bit of laceration around there. Nothing really to speak of, and like I said, the body has a lot of natural give in it that things like the head and the arms and lower arms and legs don't. Love this wind. So let's finally try we'll turn the meat over to the less damaged side and try cuts to the head. So meat turned over, so this is a completely fresh untouched side. And the first cut I'm going to show you is one described by Saviolo, where he disengages from one side of the person's rapier, raises his point vertically and cuts down onto the head. Oh, that was a jolly bad cut, but you can that was really badly aimed, but you can see I took a chunk out of the pell and destroyed my tea towel. So let's try that one again. Bloody hell. Okay, we might not get through all of the head cuts. I think you can see why people cut at targets that were not covered by clothing. Wow! That is pretty remarkable. That's not what I'd call a massively hard cut. Alright, that has actually surprised me. You would not want that into your head. This cut I want to do is one described by Joseph Sweetnam, and he has a guard where his point's high, and like the Saviolo cut, if the person isn't covering their head, he lunges and drops his sword onto their head. So let's see how effective that would be. Not quite as effective as the Saviolo one, but that went that far into the meat. So yeah, definitely not something I'd want to get hit by. The next cut is, there's quite a few cuts of this variety, but the one I'm going to show you is from Alfieri plate 24, where he's been parried by a dagger and he cuts around with a reverso to the right side of the opponent's head. There's plates in most of the masters showing this type of cut. Okay, so once again, pretty conclusive. Not all the way, but probably half the way through the meat. Again, certainly wouldn't want that. It wouldn't kill you, but it'd certainly make you think twice and would set you up for the next one. All right, the old bit of pork's looking pretty mangled, so it'll be hard to see any cut. But the last cut that I want to show you is from Alfieri plate 14, and Giganti shows it on page 90 of his second book, where you've parried in what Silver would call bastard guard to the inside, and then cut Mandritta to the left side of the face or head. So, and I think that's fairly, that was, yes, look, bits of wood bits of my pell inside the meat. So, yes, Mandritta to the head. Is it any wonder why people did rapier cuts primarily to the head? About 90% of the rapier cuts I see in manuals are aimed at the head. The head was not covered by any cloth, and as we can see, it makes a real difference to the penetrative power of the cuts. The only other cuts that were recommended by the masters were aimed at the outside of the forearm and the outside of the calf, both fairly bony bits that, if they stop working, will seriously impede your combat ability. So, which cuts work with a rapier? Here you have it. In case you're wondering what a rapier is really used for, I felt almost no resistance to that at all.
Try and go through one of the really, really meaty bits.
I get almost no sensation of, no resistance at all. It's just like...
And this is a fairly blunted rapier tip. The edge is nice and sharp.
Yes, the tip's nowhere near as sharp as the edges were, but yes, you can see what a rapier is designed to do, and it's not designed to cut. But as I often say, if you think being hit in the head with 2.5 pounds of steel is not going to hurt, you've evidently never been hit in the head with 2.5 pounds of steel. So, cuts with a rapier, debilitating if aimed at the right part of the body, would certainly set you up for that lethal thrust, but not in and of themselves a killing blow. So what are our conclusions? Well, pretty clearly, when you're cutting with a light bladed weapon, now a rapier is not a light weapon by any stretch of the imagination. Silver actually complains that they were heavier than cutting swords, but the blade, particularly the part of the blade you're cutting with, is fairly light, and it's not really profiled to cut. It's more of a slicing weapon than a chopping weapon. And so, consequently, even one layer of fabric makes a huge amount of difference to the penetrative power of those cuts. Now, obviously, being hit with 2.5, 3 pounds of steel isn't going to be pleasant at the best of times, but about 90% of the cuts that we see described in the manuals are aimed at the head, the one part of the body that in standard 16th, 17th century clothing wasn't covered by fabric. And cuts are not aimed at the body, they're not aimed at the neck. We get some aimed at the outside, the bony outside of the forearm, covered by 3 layers of fabric, but really critical. It's really hard to fence without a sword arm. And some aimed at the outside of the calf. The calf, as we saw, was covered by 1 layer of linen, unlike the legs, the thighs, that were covered by multiple layers of linen and big, puffy, billowing pants that would not just stop a rapier, but sort of fold around it. So, the conclusion. Cuts were aimed at a limited number of targets with rapier, and surprise, surprise, you're going to hear me saying again, when in doubt, do what the masters tell you. Do the cuts described by the old masters and don't do any other ones. Thanks for watching.